It takes up just a small amount of real estate, but one flagpole outside Boston City Hall is taking up a lot of space in a renewed debate about free speech and the separation of church and state. The battle started in 2017 when the group Camp Constitution asked Boston to fly a Christian flag, like something the city had done for other non-religious groups in the past. But this time, city officials denied the request, citing the religious nature of the flag and the constitutional ban on governments promoting a certain religion. In response, Camp Constitution sued the city, and today the case made it to the Supreme Court, where oral arguments seem to boil down to one issue.
What's at stake in that line between public forums and government speech?
I'm joined by Rachel Lazar. She's the president and CEO of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, which supports the city's refusal to fly the flag. And David Cole is the national legal director for the ACLU, which argues the city violated Camp Constitution's First Amendment rights. David and Rachel, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Rachel, starting with you, why should the Supreme Court support Boston's refusal to fly that flag?
Because a city should never be forced to fly a religious flag. It's an endorsement of a religion, and our Constitution promises everyone religious freedom. There's no way that at least the 40+% of folks that live in Boston that aren't Christian would walk by the Boston City Hall flagpole displaying a Christian flag and not be alarmed that their religious freedom was somehow being threatened. And the Constitution promises separation of church and state.
David, where is she wrong? Why should it be allowed?
So, we're usually on the same side as Americans United. We are often challenging government displays of religious symbols. The government, when the government is speaking, cannot favor religion, any specific religion or religion generally. But when, as here, it's not speaking, but rather creating a forum for private citizens to display their flags on a first-come, first-served basis, and when for 12 years it has approved 284 such applications from third parties to put their flags up, and then turns around and says, no, simply because the flag is religious, it has violated the First Amendment's free speech clause by refusing to treat religious speakers equally with non-religious speakers.
So, David, staying with you for a second, assuming it's a public forum, as you argue, and this is private speech, let me ask you the obvious. QAnon goes to City Hall, says we want a big Q up there. Nazis go there and say we want a swastika hanging from that third flagpole at City Hall. Even though you may find those distasteful, you would say they are entitled to have those flags fly on Boston City Hall Plaza?
They are if Boston chooses to create a public forum on its flagpole. Now, it doesn't have to create a public forum on its flagpole. Most cities don't make their flagpoles into public forums.
But you're saying Boston has created it into a public forum.
Yeah. Because it puts it out on its website as a public forum. You apply. 284 people and groups have applied in the past, and they were approved one by one. And then you can't turn around and say, once you've done that, you can't turn around and say because it's religious. Now, you could define the forum in a way that doesn't require you to put up, a swastika or that, but they didn't do that here. They said, you come to us, we'll put up your flag.
How do you respond to what David had to say, Rachel?
Yeah, so it's possible to turn sort of a place where the government operates traditionally into a public forum, and that really does open it up in the ways that you suggest. And that's actually what Boston did to the plaza in front of their city hall. It's an intentional designation. They actually didn't do that for their flagpole. And if you look at what their website says, they talk about our policy and our views that are being expressed. So it's our view that they didn't turn the flagpole itself into a public forum, and therefore we'd be violating the Establishment Clause if we forced them to fly a religious flag there.
But Rachel, let me stay with you for a minute, and I hope I get part of David's argument right, and if I get it wrong, he'll interrupt me and tell me. How can you argue that the city is favoring one religion when every single request, as David said twice, 284 out of 284 over a dozen years have been approved, just sort of as in a ministerial fashion. You apply, you get approved. End of discussion. How is that favoring anybody?
Well, there haven't been religious flags before, and there is an approval process. It's true that the approvals have gone through, but it's really important that we honor that a government never turns something into a public forum unless they officially designate it as such. And I think it's really important here to distinguish between the plaza, which has been turned into a public forum, and the actual flagpole before the seat of power that traditionally does only display a government-endorsed message, which hasn't been officially designated as such.
You know, David, I want to return to you. You said a minute ago, if the city, quote, defines the forum in a particular way. I want to play a little bit of sound between Justice Coney Barrett and Boston's lawyer and see how you react to what the lawyer had to say. Here it is.
You've said that if you lose this case, you would restructure your program so that you would be able to exercise the kind of control to exclude religious flags, like the one that Camp Constitution wanted to fly. How would you propose doing that?
If the court clarifies that that type of involvement is required, the city is happy to include that in its program. I would have no problem, I think the city would have no problem making that explicit in its policy. This is our speech. We will decide whether and when to do it.
Do you agree with the city's lawyer, David? If the city declares that what's on that flagpole is government speech, does it become government speech just by virtue of them saying it is?
Well, it's not just by virtue of them saying it is, just as whether it's a public forum doesn't turn simply on the label, because that would obviously allow governments to turn every public forum into a government speech platform in which they could exclude anyone they didn't want to have speak. But you look at the practice and you look at what they've done over time. And here the practice is clearly to allow others to speak. But could they change it? Could they change the practice and say, you know what? We don't want this to be a public forum anymore. We want this to be a forum just for the government to speak. They could absolutely do that. They didn't, and that's why they violated Camp Constitution's First Amendment rights here. But going forward, if they want to do that, they're free to do that. You're not required to open up government property to the public, but once you do, you're not allowed to discriminate based on the viewpoint of the message.
What's the, assuming that the court, starting with you, David, assuming the court comes down on your side of this thing, what's the impact? What's the precedent, if any, going forward in similar sort of cases?
Well, I think the important point is that governments should not be able to discriminate against speakers in public forums simply by claiming this is government speech, because that would essentially destroy the public forum doctrine. The public forum doctrine is important because that's where private citizens have the right to speak on public property that the government has opened up for those purposes. And if it can close it up, sort of willy-nilly on viewpoint-based grounds, simply by declaring it government speech, that's a real problem for free speech for all of us.
Rachel, doesn't that worry you?
I worry about the overreach of sort of government censorship, but not here. Not when we're talking about such a traditional place of government speech like a flagpole. I just don't think that that's a place where we would expect there to be religious flags flown, where we would expect there to be a Nazi flag flown if it's opened up, right? That is a very traditional place where we would expect a government message of endorsement to be displayed.
In our final minute, I know it is really dangerous, particularly with people who do what you two do, to ever play Nostradamus with the Supreme Court. But as an outside observer, that being me, the court's hostility, or at least to me, to any government hostility to religion suggests to me that this is likely a 6-3 winner for your side, David. What's your reaction?
I think it's likely to be more than a 6-3 winner. Justice Breyer, Justice Kagan, Justice Gorsuch, and Justice Kavanaugh all urged the city to settle the case. to settle the case. And that's because they recognize that, look, Boston's going to lose this case. We shouldn't need to decide this. And Boston basically made a mistake. It would not violate the Establishment Clause to put up this flag for 1 hour on one day in a program that had shown 284 other flags. So they made a mistake in thinking it would. Having recognized that mistake, all they have to do is settle the case. So I think it's the Supreme Court will, unless the case is not settled, will rule in favor of Camp Constitution.
You only have 15 seconds. I'd like your projection. I should have said earlier, by the way, the Biden administration is with the ACLU on this one, too. Quickly, do you see the same outcome that David does, Rachel?
I think the court is likely to designate it a public forum, in which case even the city of Boston wouldn't argue that the Christian flag can't fly. But I would say that a chill wind blows for the separation of church and state. Justice Gorsuch today called it the so-called separation of church and state. And for those who care about democracy, we're about to see a case on school prayer and also on government funding of religious education this same term. So we've got a problem. And people who support the separation of church and state as a core tenet of democracy should step up and make that viewpoint known.
Rachel Lazar, David Cole, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Be well.